Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Please direct your attention to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome back to our panel on absentee and out-of-country voting. My name is Fernanda Buril. I am the Deputy Director of IFES Center for Applied Research and Learning at IFES, and I'm also an out-of-country voter myself. As a Brazilian American living in Mexico right now, I've experienced a few different modalities of out-of-country voting, and I'm thrilled to be here today with some experts on this topic to moderate this panel, which will examine how the U.S. manages voters within and outside the U.S. Who are residing outside their constituencies. So we're going to be talking about the infrastructure that makes this possible. Also some accessibility features and considerations for this modality, and bringing also some global perspectives on the issue. So I'm very happy to be here today with my panelists, the Honorable McReynolds, who was appointed to the Postal Service Board of Governors by President Joe Biden and confirmed by the United States Senate in May of 2021. She was elected by her fellow governors to serve as vice chairperson as well. McReynolds also chairs the board's Election and Government Mayo Committee, and she's a leading expert on election administration, policy, and innovation. We are also joined by our colleague Michelle Bishop. Here she is. Hi, Michelle. She's joining us virtually today. She's the manager for voter access and engagement at the National Disability Rights Network. She leads a team to support the Protection and Advocacy Network on voting rights and voter engagement for people with disabilities. Bishop also works in coalition with the civil rights community in Washington, D.C. to ensure strong federal policy regarding voting rights and election administration from a voter-centric and intersectional perspective. And finally, we also have my colleague here, Peter Erben, who is IFES Principal Advisor and a leading authority on election management. Erben is one of a few international experts ever called upon to direct national elections for other nations. He currently works out of Ukraine, where he is also Senior Country Director for IFES and Senior Advisor to the Election Commission. He has held similar positions throughout the world for the past 3 decades, and more recently, he was doing this in Indonesia, Pakistan, Nepal, and Palestine. Now, I do encourage you to use the app to look at their full bios because they are truly amazing, and also use the feature on the app to pose questions to our panelists. So without further ado, I would like to start by asking some questions. And the first one is for you, Amber. I think a lot of our panelists have been talking or mentioning at least postal voting, right? And especially after COVID, we saw a spike in the number of people voting by mail, and this trend seems to continue, right? For these elections, we saw already more than 30 million people voting early by mail. So from your perspective and your experience, of course, what kind of actions did the United States Postal Service undertake to meet the spike in demand for mail voting?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, and it's a delight to be here with all of you ahead of this U.S. election that we have tomorrow. First and foremost, the United States Postal Service has an incredible history in service to democracy in the United States. In fact, the first ever mail ballots that happened in an election were during the Civil War, and it was Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time, and I should also note was also a postmaster when he was 18 years old in Salem, Illinois. But he, as president, wanted to make sure that all the military voters could vote, and so postal voting came about during the Civil War, and it has been in existence in the United States since that time, all because President Lincoln wanted to make sure that all military voters could vote. And so we've seen an expansion of it over the last 25 to 30 years. You probably saw the slide from one of the previous panels where you saw the growth of not only mail-in voting, but also early voting. And the Postal Service is really at the center of that entire infrastructure and operation for the United States. A couple of stats about the Postal Service. So first, we have over 630,000 employees that work at about 34,000 locations. We are the only entity, business, government, anything, that is consistently across the United States in every corner of our country and every state, including Alaska and Hawaii, where we have really difficult logistical challenges to deliver mail. And so the Postal Service has this incredible infrastructure and network that serves all people, connects businesses to government, connects people to people. In a lot of ways, and a lot of people would say this, it was the first ever social media network because it was connecting people and designed that way. We are also independent, so we're not part of the executive branch, we're not part of the legislative branch, we're actually an independent agency. And while the nation's election mail is just a small percentage of the mail that we deliver, in fact, it's about 0.11% of all of our mail, the United States, what we see go through the postal system is about 350 million pieces of mail a day, and about 30 million packages every single day through our operation. So the infrastructure is gigantic in the way that this network can serve the American people. And that's really why we've seen such growth in various parts of the country, especially on the West, for voters choosing to vote at home and vote by mail. And there's many reasons for that. Partly, on the western side of the country, we see a lot of ballot initiatives. The ballots are really long. In Colorado, in the jurisdiction that I currently vote in, the ballot is 3 pages long ballots, 3 pages, 6 sides. So it would take a voter more than an hour to complete it if they read everything on the ballot. And so that's really, we've also seen this growth in mail-in voting because we've seen our ballots get longer. We have a lot of ballot questions and issues in certain states. And the Postal Service, I would also note, so to kind of wrap and really answer this question, we deploy what we call extraordinary measures to support the election infrastructure. And we're not just delivering ballots, we're delivering election materials, voter information guides, voter registration notices, all those things that go throughout the year to voters. We're delivering all of that. And we deploy what we call extraordinary measures during elections. So our carriers are doing extra pickups, we're doing extra trips, we extend hours. The postmasters are actually allowed to extend hours if they find it necessary to serve voters, especially close to Election Day. We also have extra pickups. So we allow election officials to come and pick up the ballots from the plants directly to make sure that those ballots arrive on time. All of our carriers are right now checking every single mailbox, regardless of whether or not it says there's a piece of mail in it. They're checking every mailbox just to make sure that they capture any voter who has inserted the mail ballot in the box and make sure it gets there on time. So, and we've also utilized some of our technology platforms like Informed Delivery that we have, which tells voters what the status of their mail is each day. We've deployed messaging to push people to vote.gov and some of the federal websites that have election information on them. So we've done more this year than we've ever done before, and I couldn't be prouder of the 630,000 employees that work at the Postal Service that are right now delivering for America.
Thank you so much. Well, a question for Michelle then. Because we were talking about, some of the ballots are very long and it can be hard to spend time on actually filling it out. And mail-in ballots, mail-in voting can maybe help with that as well. But from an accessibility perspective, what kind of benefits do you see in that modality of voting? What kind of drawbacks or challenges are still out there? We have a lot of election authorities here who might be considering maybe postal voting, right? So what would you suggest or recommend for them to consider before designing, before implementing that modality?
let me say thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I'm really honored to be able to speak with such an amazing panel, and thank you so much for allowing me to join you remotely. I am a person with a disability, and getting there today was going to be really difficult. So that in itself is a really nice accessibility accommodation. I appreciate it. In terms of thinking about voting by mail, Amber will be happy to hear that I'm going to say there's a lot to like about voting by mail and really leveraging your postal system when we think about how voters interact with the process. And I think that it makes sense for voters in a lot of ways. I loved kind of that history of the soldiers needing to vote. As soon as you bring up President Lincoln in front of an American, we suddenly feel very patriotic. So that got to me right before Election Day. But it makes a lot of sense, right? When we think about traditional voting, especially in the United States, we think about one election day and going to your local polling place. I'm going down the street to a school, a church, a library, whatever it might be. I'm going to stand in line with my neighbors, cast my ballot, I'm going to get my I voted sticker. And that's how we traditionally think that it works. But realistically, we just can't guarantee that that will work for everyone. If nothing else, we can't guarantee that everyone is going to be in their home jurisdiction to get to their polling place on election day. Especially these days, we are busy and we are all over the place, and that's not how our lives work. A lot of us who work in elections have somewhere we have to be from before polls open until after they close. For people with disabilities, we can't guarantee that those systems are going to be accessible. So there's a lot that vote by mail offers in addition to traditional voting systems that I think make a lot of sense. Thinking about traditional in-person voting, we unfortunately do still see a lot of barriers for people with disabilities. We've come a long way, but it's difficult and complicated to solve. We still see the U.S. Government Accountability Office. The last time they were able to actually survey polling places was in 2016. We did not do it in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic, unfortunately. But in the 2016 survey, we saw that less than half of America's polling places are actually fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a lot of reasons for that. Elections officials use locations that are voluntarily willing to serve as polling places, and not all of them are fully compliant or fully accessible, and elections officials have to make that work. So we can't guarantee that a person with a disability can go to their polling place and access their ballot that way. Vote by mail helps us to avoid a lot of those problems. It helps us to also get around auxiliary systems that people might use when they're voting that elections officials have no control over. Like, is there a public transit system in place to get me to that location? Is it accessible? Are there accessible cabs? Is an Uber going to pick me up and let my service dog get in the car? There are a lot of concerns for people with disabilities that exist outside the electoral system that we can't control, but will still have an impact on access for people with disabilities. Vote by mail is a great way to take a lot of that concern out of the process. I also like something Amber talked about is that voters can sit down with their ballot at home. And I think that makes a huge difference. Ballots are getting longer and turnout is getting higher. I love that turnout's getting higher, that's amazing. But all of these things add up to longer lines at the polling place. And so when you have your ballot at home, you can take your time. You're not feeling rushed. There are some places where there's a limit to how long you can be in the voting booth. That's not a concern when you're at home. You can use whatever technology might help you to access that ballot as a person with a disability. You can have someone handy there to assist you. If that's something you need, that is something that you have a federal right to as an American voter. So it adds a lot to the system. I think vote by mail makes a lot of sense. I will say it's not a panacea. It doesn't automatically solve all of our accessibility woes. If you're adding a vote by mail process, you have to think about how we can make it as accessible as possible. And we do still see in a lot of states some extra hoops to jump through that I think just make it more complicated for people with disabilities. There are places where you have to get sometimes multiple witness signatures attesting that you are who you are. I don't find that particularly effective. That seems that you could get anyone to sign those. Or something that, I'll be honest, seems easy to fake if you were really determined. But not everyone has witnesses handy, and I think that was really shown to us in 2020 during the pandemic, where if you didn't live with someone who was going to witness your ballot, you were opening yourself up to a great deal of risk. For a person with a disability, that's a very serious proposition. A lot of people with disabilities are higher risk for more severe forms of COVID. Notaries, there are some places that require a notary. I don't even know where to find a notary. And I live in an urban area. For someone in a rural area, I can't imagine that there are a lot of notaries and that they're easy to get to in places that don't have public transit systems for people with disabilities. We do see some places that require a doctor's note if you want to vote by mail all the time, attesting that you have a disability. Once again, I just don't necessarily see the benefit of that. A person with a disability can sign an affidavit swearing that they have a disability, and I think it's going to have the same effect. So I think we want to not add extra hoops to jump through in the system. I do like states that are automatically mailing out ballots or have a permanent vote by mail list that you can get on. I think that makes it easier for a person with a disability who knows this is going to be the best accommodation for me every time. We still see a lot of signature matching in the US to verify those ballots, and I do think there has to be a better way. Someone who's done a lot more work specifically in vote by mail might have a better solution than I, but I don't trust the signature matching is going to be effective for people with disabilities. If you have any type of difficulty with manual dexterity or tremors or anything like that, your signature is going to look different every single time. You could sit down and sign 10 times in a row and they're not going to match. So I worry that signature matching could accidentally be catching people with disabilities. I think there has to be a better way to verify. Other than that, I think you want to have a robust system for carrying ballots. If there's a question, we need to make sure that we're actively contacting voters and that we have multiple ways for them to verify their identities to make the system more accessible. I do think we should also offer ballot tracking after your ballot has been sent in. If nothing else, voters feel more confident. My ballot was received, it was counted, I'm a part of the process. I have personal loved ones who I know track their ballots, and if it hasn't been counted yet, they say, it's been received, but it hasn't been counted, Michelle, what's going on? And I said, they get a lot of ballots, give it a minute, right? And eventually it gets counted, and people feel good. They know that their ballot was received and that it's been counted. The last thing I could recommend that I think is really helpful and that's drastically increased in the United States since 2020 is the use of ballot drop boxes. If we don't have enough polling places or in-person locations or elections offices or wherever it may be to drop off that ballot, I think it makes sense to offer drop boxes as well. There are a lot of places like where I live where there is a postal office and a postal box every couple of blocks, but I don't know that that's true everywhere. And we don't know that all post offices are compliant with the ADA and accessible to people with disabilities. Adding drop boxes is an easy thing that we can do to make sure that there's a drop-off location wherever you are. We just stress making sure that the drop box is designed accessibly and it's placed on an accessible path of travel. A lot of elections officials added drop boxes because of the COVID pandemic very quickly and didn't always think about the accessible path of travel so that a person with a disability can get up to that box and drop off their ballot. But with a little bit of pre-planning, I think there's a lot you can add to a vote by mail system to make sure it's going to work best for the largest number of voters.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Those are very, very interesting points, and I think when I go to a polling station now, I'm very aware of accessibility issues, and I'm looking for ramps, and I'm looking for magnifying lenses, but those issues that you're mentioning, right, it's not just about the polling station, it's about the route, about transportation, about people's commitments to work or personal commitments and not being able to attend a polling station, so that's very interesting. Well, Peter has been working in this field for a long time. He's seen a lot of postal voting, other modalities of out-of-country voting. And so, Peter, I'm interested in your perspectives in terms of, we heard some of the accommodations, some of the features and improvements that the U.S. has implemented to allow for out-of-country voting. What kind of improvements do you think could be, taken as lessons learned for other countries, and vice versa? What kind of global lessons learned could be used in the U.S.?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm extremely excited about being here, honored being here amongst so many election professionals. It's really great that we have this opportunity to come together and share our experiences, and I hope after this presentation I'll have a chance to speak with more of you about the details of out-of-country voting and especially using postal voting for this. Now, one problem we have today in elections is that politicians never lose the election anymore. They're always defrauded. It's never their popularity that was too low. And as they try to explain why they lost the election, they always look for the weakest points. What is the easiest way to explain that I was defrauded of this election? And there, out-of-country voting, which is a huge issue for many of our election commissions around the world is exactly such a sensitive area where many turn to, and therefore there is an added requirement for integrity when we try and do out-of-country voting for our voters abroad, and especially when we try and use postal voting, both out-of-country and in-country. IFES has the honor of working with election commissions, many of you around the world, on finding better ways, more effective ways to hold national elections. We also at times have the opportunity to work with election commissions with countries that have come out of conflict and who has to re-establish their elections. And in doing so, we've had the chance to do out-of-country elections for some of the nations that are here, work with you on these, and the hard way had to learn how to do postal voting in such a manner that it can be trusted. And it really is very difficult. We see many nations around the world that are looking at postal voting, using postal voting, be very careful in their approach because it is a method of voting which is particularly difficult to build integrity around. And as such, I do think that there are important lessons that we can learn now that we're all gathered here for the US election. So it's excellent to hear from you how it is done in the US. In fact, US, it's such an enormous ecosystem of methodologies. Almost everything is being used here in different ways. So it gives us election administrators a chance to see not one election, but many, many elections done in different ways with different methodologies. And I think looking at the US, the things that are right, the things that are wrong, gives us a real chance to learn. And here I will say on postal voting, it definitely is an ecosystem that's worthwhile for us as election administrators to look at. And if I was to take one feature of how it's done here in the US, it is exactly what was mentioned just previously, namely the attempt to try and track postal voting so that people can truly feel that their vote is on the way and eventually that it has arrived and that it will be counted. Because I do think that this is a huge issue in building integrity on postal voting, is to give people that confidence that their ballot is being dealt with in a responsible manner. And it also makes it easier to adjudicate any challenges there may be to postal voting. And again, it's such a favorite point for losing politicians to attack, that anything we can do to build preciseness, accountability, audits, and so forth is worthwhile. And there I really believe tracking gives us a fantastic opportunity to do so. So that's one feature I think all of us election administrators can look at when we look at the US and might be able to take home to our respective postal systems, or as we use postal voting in voting abroad. The question of what can the US learn from what we see around the world in both postal voting and in out-of-country voting, I would say, you know, if I look at the US and I think of the standard of having equal access to vote, I think the US has a long way to go, partly because elections are done so differently in different places. And in some places in the US, it's made very, very difficult for some demographies to actually cast their vote. So I do think that we as election administrators in most of our countries, we work hard to make sure that every voter has an equal voting experience, have an equal access to vote. We try and build systems that are streamlined and that are uniform. We even think about the voting experience in country versus what the voting experience is out of country. We try and make sure that everyone learns to vote the same way and can vote the same way. So that might be a thing that with reform in the US over time, hopefully elections will become more uniform, the voting experience will be more equal for everyone. And I think it makes elections easier when everyone does it more or less the same way.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think that's a great segue into another question for Amber. You mentioned in the beginning how the United States Postal Service is an independent institution, right? But you still, of course, have to work with election authorities at the federal, local, state levels. So how does that work? How can you coordinate across those levels? What are the challenges that you encounter? How do you make this super complex and different systems come together for successful postal voting?
Yes, it is exceedingly complicated. And you know, a lot of times you hear about there being 50 different states processes. There's actually about 8,500 different local election offices, and that means there's 8,500 different variations of envelopes. The design, the size, where the addressing is, the barcode information on that. And frankly, most election offices are not following. The Postal Service has a kit, it's called the Kit 600, and it's our recommendations of best practices and guidelines to election officials on how to successfully use the Postal Service and get election mail through the system in the most efficient and effective and secure manner. And as we've been surveying, we find that in a lot of states still, a lot of these local election offices are not following those best practices because it's not a mandated guideline. And so one thing, given the complexity of so many different jurisdictions, that actually puts tremendous pressure on the Postal Service to accommodate all these different variations. And so one thing that I really want to see going forward is actually us mandating more requirements on the best practices, what the envelope designs look like, what jurisdictions include in terms of the intelligent mail barcode, which that intelligent mail barcode is what we key off of for the ballot tracking systems. And I should say on that, I'm just going to make one note and a plug for Denver, Colorado. So ballot tracking was designed by my team in Denver, Colorado in 2009. Incredible team of all different staff members were involved in that. We designed that in 2009, rolled it out to voters in Colorado in 2010, and that was the first in the world that had ever been done before. And so what it does is it leverages that intelligent mail barcode that appears on both the outbound ballot to the voter and the same thing back. We have a unique intelligent mail barcode on the return, and you as a voter can see exactly where your ballot is on the way out to you and then all the way back to you, and you get a text, an email, or even a phone call on the status and the disposition of your mail ballot. So you know immediately if there's a signature problem or if you forgot to sign it, or even if the ballot was undeliverable, the voter gets a notice of that immediately and they can take steps to cure that. And when we developed that system, we mainly were developing it to try to reduce our call volume. So our top call driver in 2008 was, when is my ballot arriving? And did you get my ballot back? And I looked at the data after the election and I asked the team, I said, boy, it sure would be great to get rid of 80% of our call volume so that we don't have to spend so many resources on this. So we created it, and the great thing about it is it accomplished many tasks for us. We reduced our call volume by actually 85% because of that system. We reduced our costs, we enhanced security, we enhanced accessibility of the process, and we added more transparency, not only for the voter, but election offices can see all that data on the background too. So when we would drop our mail ballots to the Postal Service, I would actually know within 24 hours by precinct how many ballots that the post office had processed and scanned through their system. And so if they weren't at 95%, I was on the phone with the district manager saying, when are you going to finish? And so it was an accountability tool for the post office. And I can't say enough how important this feature is for mail ballots and for programs around absentee voting, both international, but also within country as well. And then I would also just say I chair the Election and Government Mail Committee, which we did not have that committee as a Board of Governors until 2020. And now it's a permanent committee. And not only are we looking at election mail, but all government mail, because we look at these opportunities to provide support. One of the things that we did in terms of government mail was the delivery of COVID test kits to all Americans, and that was in coordination with the Biden administration. And now the Postal Service has delivered, we've handled the entire supply chain. So citizens can sign up to get the COVID test kit on our website. We package it, we deliver it, and now over 1 billion test kits have been delivered to Americans over the last year and a half or 2 years since that program's been in place. So there's just tremendous opportunity for the postal services or the postal offices within all countries to provide that extra support and services to citizens.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. This is
Oh,
a truly
thanks.
impressive
Thank you.
system. I know we are talking a lot about postal voting, of course, and we have one question from the audience asking if Americans can also vote electronically, right, online, or only by mail. And that brings me to another question that I had for Michelle, because, well, what we know is that some voters in some states can vote for some elections online. But recently, in North Carolina and Indiana, some disability rights groups filed suits against the state, and they actually successfully won the right to expand the pool of voters who can cast their votes online to allow for equal rights, especially for people with disabilities. So Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about the internet voting modality? How does it affect people with disabilities, what kind of benefits it brings, and what kind of challenges you still see with that modality as well?
I'm glad we're talking about this, because when we're thinking about how you make your vote by mail process accessible, this is a really critical piece. When we talk about voting absentee or voting by mail, traditionally it is exactly what it sounds like. I put a paper ballot in the mail, you receive it at home, you fill it out, and you mail it back. And there's a lot of folks for whom that works very well. But there are some for whom it does not, including people with disabilities. The paper in itself can actually be a huge barrier. If you are someone who has limited to no use of your hands, including people who are quadriplegic with no movement from the neck down, they can't physically handle that piece of paper to mark it, fold it, get it in or out of the envelope, any of those things. If you're blind or low vision, you can't necessarily read the ballot or mark it effectively if it's something that you can't read. For people with all types of learning disabilities, being able to access an audio ballot and listen to the ballot rather than read it off the paper is actually helpful. In the US, we have a classification of people with disabilities that we call print disabled, and that's just anyone for whom, all the folks I've named, where paper in itself is going to be a barrier. So the ability to deliver those ballots electronically is really a game changer for people with disabilities. And it is in use all over the country. We are required to send military and overseas voters their ballots electronically. So this is something that's been in use all over and for a while now, actually. This is not a new technology, and especially in those states that have been using vote by mail for a long time, those Western states that Amber talked about, this is something that they've been using a very long time to make their vote by mail systems more accessible. It looks a little different depending on where you are. When we say, online voting or internet voting, I think everyone gets one image that maybe I log into a website and there's my ballot. And that is the case in some places. There is an online portal that you log into and you complete the process through that portal. We tend to call it electronic ballot delivery because it looks different everywhere. It might leverage email systems or e-fax and things like that to get the ballot to the voter and for the voter to return the ballot. So what we see accessibility-wise is that ability to send the ballot electronically eliminates that need for paper handling and being able to read and mark paper. It also allows people with disabilities to use the technologies that they have to make the ballot accessible to them. The same way we see in the polling place. We have electronic ballot marking devices in polling places because we recognize that paper doesn't work for everyone. So if I'm blind and I go to my polling place, I can put on the headphones, I can hear the audio ballot, I can mark it using an electronic device. If I go home and you mail me a paper ballot to my home, I do not magically regain my vision. When I sit down at my kitchen table, I'm still blind. I still need access to that paper. So it's a way of taking the technologies that we're offering in the polling place and allowing people to use them at home. If they have a computer, an iPad, whatever device they need, and it has a screen reader to be able to read it to them as an audio ballot, whatever it may be. Different ways of moving the mouse and clicking buttons, all sorts of technologies you can't imagine. You can move a cursor with your eye movements these days. There's incredible things out there. Technology makes the whole world so much more accessible to people with disabilities. And you can use that to mark your ballot if we're able to send it to electronically. In some places, you can even return it electronically as well, and we find that to be the most accessible. In some places, people with disabilities are required to print the ballot and return it. And then once again, we're adding paper back to the process. So, if I was quadriplegic with no movement from the neck down, and that completed ballot rolls up on the printer, what am I doing with that? I can't reach over and pick it up and fold it and put it in an envelope. That's just not an option for me. So we're adding some inaccessibility back into the system. To say nothing of the fact that I'm not sure about, where everyone came from today. In the United States, a lot of people don't own printers anymore. We don't have a printer in the home to even be able to print that ballot. So it can be a barrier for any number of reasons. So we like to see those fully electronic processes versus adding that paper component. It's increased in a number of states. We're taking basically the systems that already exist for military and overseas voters, and we're just letting people with disabilities use that same system that's already in place, that we already trust, to be able to provide voting to our military and overseas voters. The only real concern that we've heard about this, since it's been expanded in use, are related to election security. Like we heard earlier, these days when candidates lose, they don't say they lost. They say something was taken from them. And so election security concerns are very real and they're very serious, and we have to take them seriously. Which is why, if you are familiar with my organization, the National Disability Rights Network, you don't really see us out there saying, internet voting for everyone now. What we say is we need to be able to provide ballots electronically to the people who need them most to ensure that they're not disenfranchised. If there are security concerns, I take that seriously, but we have to be willing to take a measured, calculated amount of risk to ensure that voters won't be disenfranchised. And that's what we do for our military and overseas voters. We let them vote electronically because we know if we don't, they could be disenfranchised. We want to do the same thing for people with disabilities, even if they're in the United States. Let the people with print disabilities who need it most use these systems so that they're not disenfranchised. And if someday we feel much more confident about our ability to secure them, maybe we should have a conversation about internet voting for everyone now. Living in the country where once people voted more for American Idol than they did for the president, I think it's because they can do it from their phones right there while they're watching the show. And that makes a difference. If we don't feel like we can get there today, that's okay. But we do have to be able to, there will always be inaccessibility in the system, and there will always be security risks in the system. As long as there are ballots, both of those things will be true. But we have to really strike a balance. And we have to say, where are we willing to take a calculated risk to ensure that everyone's able to vote? There are two ways to ensure that our elections are accurate and fair and represent the will of the people. One is to secure the ballots, and the other is to make sure that everyone actually gets to cast one. And so when we look at electronic voting, I think it's a really critical piece of your vote by mail system to make sure that people, and particularly people with print disabilities, won't be disenfranchised.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And striking that balance, I think it's a very challenging goal that we are all thinking about right now, right? So thank you for your insights into the accessibility perspective, but also the technical issues and the cybersecurity challenges that are still out there as well. Switching gears a little, of course, I mentioned in the beginning, Peter is currently based in Ukraine, which we all know, unfortunately, is facing a war and fighting a war against Russian invaders. Also, Peter worked in many conflict and post-conflict environments, and in those countries, we usually see a lot of people fleeing the country, right, as refugees and even internally displaced persons. So in those cases, when the election authorities are trying to implement out-of-country voting at that large scale, we can imagine that challenges compound, right? So in your experience, how does it work? What changes in those contexts? What are the challenges? How have countries tried to overcome challenges for large-scale out-of-country voting operations?
Well, it's quite humbling sitting in front of the colleagues that are with us here today, because so many election commissions, so many commissioners are facing this very challenge in their daily lives for their nations. I mean, again, IFES has been fortunate that we work across the world and we partner and assist many election commissions, and many of you are dealing with the out-of-country voting issue in your specific jurisdiction. In fact, I know that there are numerous countries here now that are considering whether they should indeed do out-of-country voting. Out-of-country voting itself is not an absolute standard for being a good democracy as such, because there are many nations for whom it simply is very, very difficult to implement full out-of-country voting around the globe. And clearly, the most difficult challenges are for nations that have just come out of conflict or out of revolution, are trying to re-establish themselves. And there we see, on top of all the other complications that come after conflict, after revolution, after significant societal change, there is always an added demand for that out-of-country voting will take place. And that is particularly because we have very large population groups that were forced away from their home by the conflict itself or by the change itself. And nowhere is that more evident right now than in Ukraine, where there are millions of Ukrainians that have been forced away from their home, forced to other places in Ukraine or beyond Ukraine, and are now sheltering around the world. I am extremely honored today to be joined by Chairman Didenko of the Ukraine Central Election Commission and his group, who are definitely going to face this issue within the coming years when the war hopefully comes to an end, and one has to look at how to enfranchise the many millions that will very likely still be abroad even in years after peace comes, simply because they have nowhere to live after Russia has flattened significant parts of Ukraine. And that's going to be very difficult because just like we talked about previously, the elections that will happen when martial law has been lifted, when peace comes to Ukraine, will be highly competitive elections. And there again, one of the most difficult things to organize is to see to that the franchise is extended way beyond Ukraine's borders. And the Ukrainian Election Commission, Ukraine Parliament, Ukraine leaders are already now trying to think about how can this happen, how can this be put together. Now IFES has had the opportunity to work with election commissions around the world on such programs before, most notably for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina after the Balkan Wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. And there again, there were elements of postal voting implemented. But it is really a big challenge to make these processes work and to get a trusted result out of this, given the vulnerabilities that we discussed earlier that you have when you use, for example, postal voting. And when you have voting in places that are not at home, which are abroad, and where maybe there is not the same level of transparency around how the election itself unfolded. And as such, we've had many, many challenges when we were implementing this. I mean, it's of course daunting to hear you talk about how different jurisdictions are around the United States. But for a country that has just come out of war to have to figure out holding their elections in a whole range of other countries where they have no jurisdiction, where it is under other laws, where it is with different types of security arrangements, where in fact in some of these countries the laws themselves prohibit certain aspects of this, such as opening polling stations outside the embassies. That's a big challenge. When we were assisting the Iraq Election Commission with the holding of elections around the world, we were negotiating MOUs with countries all over the globe where Iraqi refugees were sheltering. And in doing so, we got to hold elections in, for example, Iran. We held elections in Syria. In fact, Iraq had relatively democratic elections held throughout Syria, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and other complicated places. We also had the pleasure of trying to hold elections throughout the United States. And there experienced how different it is to hold elections in different places in the United States. Some places with extreme assistance to us, some places with everything done to stop the election from taking place. In the United Kingdom is one of my favorite examples because when we were trying to figure out how to hold elections for the many Iraqi refugees in the United Kingdom, we did approach the authorities and asked if we could sign an MOU. They sort of laughed lightly at us and said, you would never want to negotiate an MOU with the United Kingdom. But we are a country that has dealt with very, very large international exercises. So you go down to Wembley Stadium and you hold your election in Wembley Stadium, and we're going to make sure that it works and that it'll be secure, but we're not going to sign anything. So this issue of dealing with many, many different jurisdictions is really one of the largest challenges when you try and hold these large out-of-country voting exercises, be it with postal voting, be it with distributed in-person voting where we have polling stations all over the country, or be it a combination thereof. One of the other challenges that I've seen over the years that's really difficult for some nations is to decide where to hold out-of-country voting, because it's not always possible to do it everywhere. And this choice can sometimes be political, because certain demographies of the diaspora, of refugees, may vote in a certain manner. And it means that when you look at the world and you ask yourself, where can we make out-of-country voting available? Sometimes you also make a political choice or can be seen to make a political choice. Maybe the people that are in country X are workers that typically are, would vote for a specific spectrum of political parties. Maybe the refugees that would be in London with a very high prices of living there would vote differently. So how do you make sure that you make services equally available and maintain the political integrity of these distributed voting exercises? It can be extremely difficult. Lastly, I would say that I think that because of the extreme media situation that elections are held in today, I think when it is done worldwide, it's extra sensitive to disinformation and to media in general. And one reason is that whenever a country, especially one out of war, out of revolution, holds a worldwide election, the media tends to be very interested. They want pictures, they want stories. And often it's easier to go down around the corner, visit a, say, Iraqi polling station in, say, London, and do a story there. So the scrutiny is extreme on these things. And small mistakes are very often over-reported and can directly impact the integrity of an election which is otherwise mostly being held at home. So when any country sets out to hold worldwide elections, I actually believe that the strategy for managing communication, managing disinformation, is particularly important in order to make sure that these out-of-country votes do not fundamentally and unfairly undermine the integrity of the result of the country that in itself is actually trying to do something good. So I think that for election administrations around the world, out-of-country voting, be it in person, be it postal voting, is one of the most interesting and monumental challenges that we face as election administrators. And at IFES, we like challenges, and we love working with our colleagues around the world on trying to make these things happen. So that would be my comment on out-of-country voting.
Thank you, Peter. So what I hear is that there is no easy task when it comes to elections, domestically, abroad, postal, in person, internet, whatever it is, we're going to have a lot of challenges. So going to some questions from the audience now. We have a question here that I think is mainly for you, Amber, about the potential for loss or manipulation of mail votes, and how the US electoral system and infrastructure mitigate such threats. And I think we have some recent unfortunate examples, right, in the states of Washington and Oregon. You guys might have seen some drop boxes for mail ballots were set on fire. So what kind of measures are there to try to prevent that loss or to mitigate the issue, you know, caused sometimes by spoilers within the country itself?
Well, elections are definitely all about risk mitigation. I've been in election administration for more than 2 decades now, and served as an election official for 13 years. So I think about all of the risks that we were trying to mitigate at the in-person voting locations, including bomb threats, active shooter threats, training that we had to do for election officials on those topics, power outages, other, natural disaster, weather events, all those things and all of those risks around in-person voting. And, what's interesting, and then, you factor in long lines, accessibility challenges, as Michelle mentioned, when you actually look at the ecosystem, I would argue there's actually far more risks that impact in-person voting and more unknowns that have to be planned for and prepared for, including even things like staffing shortages. And then when you look at the postal voting process, mail voting process, that has risks as well. But in a lot of ways, we can mitigate a lot of those risks because we're giving people more time. The incident that happened, I'm sure many of you saw in the news that someone lit a drop box on fire in Oregon and one in Washington. First off, those are felonies and they're all on camera. So whatever criminal did that, license plate's already been captured. Apparently it was the same person in both states, same car, same vehicle. All that stuff is known because of the security parameters that we had around that particular unit. And so that individual is going to get caught, and there's stiff penalties because it's also a cross-state crime that occurred. And so the disincentives, we've put around those things to encourage people to follow the law and that sort of thing, and then hold them accountable if they don't, are important. And I would also, on the preventing those sorts of things or eliminating risk, the election system itself has so many risks in all aspects of the process. But I think one of the most effective ways to mitigate risks across the entire process is to have more time, more days of voting, more opportunities for people to vote. And in that instance, because of things like ballot tracking, because of the other because, for instance, it's a requirement in one of those states that they empty the box on a certain schedule, there weren't as many that could have been, for instance, in that box because it had been emptied the night before. So all of those policy choices, those decisions, those operational procedures and matters greatly impact mitigating those risks. And, I often also talk about another risk, which I think is one of our biggest challenges in the United States, and this is non-voters. So in 2020 we had 67% turnout, which was our highest on record. Some states had 80%, like the state I'm from, we're at 80% because we give voters all options to vote. Some states like Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee are always at the bottom of turnout because they have all these barriers in place for people to participate. And so one of the things that I think mail-in voting mitigates the risk of is voters missing the opportunity to participate. So that 67% in 2020 means that 80 million eligible voters did not vote in 2020. And when surveyed as to why, a pretty large group of them missed the voter registration deadline in the state, didn't understand what the deadline was to sign up for an absentee ballot, couldn't get off work on election day because that was the only day they had, didn't understand the procedures. It wasn't that they were apathetic, it was that the process was too difficult. So I think that's also a risk in any electoral process that we need to mitigate, which is help people understand what they can do and how they can do it in the voting process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Amber. And so you're talking about the mitigation measures after the ballot has already been cast, right? One of the questions from our audience was about safeguards for mail ballots in the first place. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that question because it's general and you guys have already covered part of it. But one of the arguments sometimes that we hear is that, when you're voting from home or from wherever you're voting, it's an unsupervised environment, right? So as opposed to a polling station where there are observers, there are poll workers. So what kind of challenges do you see with that issue of perhaps intimidation or coercion of voters in unsupervised environments? And maybe I'll start with Michelle if you have any thoughts on that, and then also open for you guys.
I do, and I can be quick, because this is something we hear a lot around voters with disabilities, is that if we send ballots to voters with disabilities in their homes, that there are going to be family members or caretakers who are going to try to influence them, how they should mark their ballots. And I think that is, well, I have a few responses to that. One, if we're concerned that someone's going to try to influence who they should vote for, that's not illegal. That's literally what campaigning is. And you're allowed to do that. I try to influence everyone I love on who I think they should vote for because I think I'm right. And that part's okay. When it crosses a line into coercion and those sorts of things, that's when we see an issue. But that's already a crime in the United States. And that's how we handle crime, is that we punish the person who committed the crime. What we don't do are limit the options and potentially disenfranchise the person who could be the victim of a crime in the name of trying to save them. And we see that a lot with people with disabilities. We see that, we shouldn't let them vote from home. We shouldn't let them have an assistant when they go to vote. There are some arguments that we shouldn't let people with intellectual disabilities vote at all to protect them from these people who would try to coerce them. But we don't protect your rights by taking your rights away from you, right? No one ever told me as an American that I can't have a driver's license because someday someone might try to steal my car, or my mother might give me bad directions, right? You don't deny me my rights to try to protect me. You make it a crime for someone to steal my car, and if my mother gives me bad directions, that is between me and my mother. And so for people with disabilities, we have to open up the system as much as possible and give them as many options as possible to make voting accessible so that people can choose the method that works for them. And if someone would attempt to coerce a person with a disability, that's a crime. And people with disabilities can either, one, prevent that from happening, or if they are victimized in that way, report it, and that person can be dealt with. That's how the criminal justice system works, and I don't think that it benefits voters at all to close off options that work for them in the name of trying to protect them.
Thank you so much. Peter, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Well, of course, now this comment was very much in the US context. If we look at this issue globally, I do believe that it is difficult because the secrecy of voting is very important. And there are numerous facets that we need to look at. One of them is, of course, that in some countries there are, for example, significant gender equality issues, and there is an overwhelming amount of pressure on women, how they should or should not vote. And basically, these are some of the societies that we try to serve. So the gender equality issue and men forcing their vote upon their wives is a real concern when we're looking at postal voting. Again, US does not have significant vote buying issues, but if postal voting is fully implemented in a nation that suffers profoundly from vote buying, then it gets more complicated because it is much, much easier to buy votes when postal voting is applicable. So I do think that it's context dependent, and many of the guests that we have at this conference live in environments where postal voting, for these two examples that I gave, is not an easy thing to implement. Now, it's of course interesting, you mentioned online voting, something that I still believe is in its nascency at IFES. We hope that one day it will be fully realized, and we're working hard on it. But one problem with online voting is also that it offers the opportunity for pressuring voters. Estonia has addressed this in a wonderful way, that you can vote as many times as you want online, and it's the last time you vote within a deadline that counts. And that feature, for example, is built to try and avoid or try and give a person that was coerced or that was pressured the opportunity to basically next day, when, say, the husband isn't home, go and vote again. But these are real issues, and these are issues that many of us deal with, and something that we have to consider for example, postal voting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And of course, Amber, this might be outside the mandate here, but how concerned are you about those issues in terms of intimidation for voters voting by mail?
Well, so first in the US, and I'll be quick with this, the postal voting, mail voting process is multidimensional in the security features. So in the states that automatically mail or proactively mail a ballot, it only goes to active registered voters, and those states have very aggressive laws and policies to verify voters' addresses in advance. So they run things like the National Change of Address database, which is managed by the Postal Service. That's when you as a voter go and update your address. You could do it through the postal system. We know immediately, and we have the most accurate address library in the country. And so a lot of those election officials, they proactively check those lists before a ballot is ever mailed. So that's like one aspect. Then you've got the ballot tracking that I mentioned. There's security features within the envelope to protect secrecy and privacy, and even they change each election. Many election officials will alternate the way the envelope is designed, what the inside liner looks like, so that nothing can be replicated. Signature verification is the most prevalent identity verification system that we have in the United States. As we talked about earlier, every state is different with everything they do, and especially with state IDs. We don't have a national ID in the United States, so state IDs become one of the forms. Signature verification is another with cure processes, but there's all these different processes, and when you add all those layers, you actually have a very complete, robust, secure process and system. And on the coercion, just quickly, all the states that will mail, there are protections should a voter call and say, I was coerced at home. They would be able to go vote in person and provisional. The ballot would potentially be canceled even before it's counted. And so there's all those measures that have been thought about to deal with an instance of a voter being coerced. And we have had problems of coercion outside of polling places. I won't even go into the opioid crisis that's been in various parts of the country, and that being offered as a way to get somebody to vote inside, and they just use their phone, take a picture of their in-person vote, come outside and get their opiate. That's literally happened in a few states in this country. So I think we also have to kind of put this in context and try to then build those disincentives to make sure that people aren't interfering with voters in that way.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you so much to all the panelists. We are unfortunately out of time, but this is a fascinating topic, so I really appreciate you guys being here, listening to those thoughts and perspectives, and I really appreciate you guys joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.